So in the UK, even though people believe that there is vast quantities of suitable land, the reality is that we are in a marginal climate and we need to use all of the environmental elements to our favour. So certainly in our site selection we wanted to ensure we had south-facing vineyards with decent slope, and that's all about not only heat accumulation in the course of the day with vineyards sloped towards the passing sun, but also the slope allows during the springtime any concern for frost for that cold air to drain and not cause any frost issues. The other issue of course is you need to be below 100 metres. You want to ensure you have decent commercial sized blocks to make it efficient to farm. And the other concern with viticulture in this country is wind. So, in certainly large blocks you want to have windbreaks around it. And so the sites you would have seen today were all tree lined.
Yeah.
And obviously when we went out to see various vineyards, we looked at these two and had all the raw ingredients for a great site. And again, in marginal climates, site selection is key. In the UK, if you don't get the right plot, you'll be pushing water uphill for years.
And you mentioned the size of the plot. What sort of quantity are you talking about?
So in acres, the vineyard plot that we planted in 2014 is 30 acres. The plot that we're planting today through the rest of this week is another 30 acres. And then there's a final third that we'll be planting in 2017, which is also 30. So 90 acres or 30 hectares for argument's sake.
And what do you hope that'll translate into bottles?
At cruising speed, about 250,000.
250,000 bottles?
Yeah.
Okay.
He smiles. Basically, it all depends on soil types in terms of your choice of rootstock. The workhorse in the viticultural world is a rootstock called SO4 or SO4, as the French would say. It would not survive on high chalk soils, and it's not just about the chalk, it's about what they call active chalk or active calcium carbonate, which basically leaches iron or the ability for the vines to take up iron. So we had to choose rootstocks, of which there are only two that can survive on that particular soil type. They are Fercal and 41B. So the rootstock selection was actually a very easy one because the soil really allowed only two to be used. The bigger question was about the clones. We want to make sparkling wine here primarily, so the choice was the Champagne varieties, so Chardonnay, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier. But within a variety like Chardonnay, there's about 25 different clones. So what we're trying to do, because we will only produce wine from the grapes we grow ourselves, which is quite a unique position, we want to have diversity in the clonal selection, which will give you diversity in the flavour spectrum and therefore hopefully more complex, interesting wines.
When you see, like we have in recent news, the frost hitting Burgundy and those kinds of things, how does that make you feel?
Well, I think it's being realistic about the fact that we're growing grapes in a marginal climate, and growing grapes in England is very much, we're on the very fringes of viability of actually getting grapes properly ripe to create wine. So I think that certainly we're very well aware that frost is a huge risk. But again, when it comes down to site selection, you try and mitigate your risks by being sensible about where you plant. Now, clearly, we now have all sorts of. We have a weather station out in one of our vineyards to be able to watch temperature and be made aware of temperatures if they're dropping below zero. And in those circumstances, we would have to take action. But because we've got 10 years, we were able to purchase 10 years of data, of weather data for this particular area. There's only ever been 2 frost incidences in the past 10 years within the relevant early growing period. So we think that we're, compared to Burgundy, I think we're in an area where we're going to have less risk.
And that's also the position of where we are in East Kent, surrounded really by the sea. Whitstable's up the road, Dover's down the road, Sandwich is to the east of us, and so we are really surrounded by sea on all 3 sides, and so it is very much a climate that's pretty maritime climate, is pretty consistent. So.
And it avoids the extremes, whereas somewhere like both Champagne and Burgundy, that's much more driven by continental weather, and therefore you are going to get colder winters, and you're going to get hotter summers, in balance. But here it's actually going to be a more moderate climate.
From where you are now, from when you say I want to produce sparkling wine, you have a picture in your mind. What do you want to produce, and what's your approach to producing the wine, whether it's that or what you actually end up with?
Tough one. I guess like all things, we've learned over the 15 years of producing wine in France, is you can have a perfectly sensible, clever idea and it fails miserably, and you can have some pretty silly ones that blossom and work very well. So I think you just need to be very open-minded, and the truthful answer to that question is we don't really know what we have out there. We obviously know the clones and the rootstocks and the varieties, but we've never grown grapes in this country. So I think you have to be open-minded. To be very rigid and prescriptive about a style now would almost be a recipe for disaster. And you have to be humble enough to go, this was the idea, but in reality this is probably the better idea, given what you can actually achieve from those particular blocks. Now, with that said, what we have a personal preference for, and it's a selfish preference, and that is that we like the red-driven champagne style. So Pinot dominant, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier dominant wines, I think they're just more complex. We think they're slightly more in balance, and we think particularly in a climate like the UK where there is sort of this racy acidity, there's the ability to soften and make those wines more approachable by using a higher percentage of red. So there is certainly an ethos to concentrate, and certainly the way we've planted the vineyards would respect that sort of ethos. But we'd be the first to say in the early days, if we had some absolutely brilliant Chardonnay and the reds didn't do too well in the first couple of years for whatever reason, we would make them Blanc de Blanc. So anything we tell you will probably be the complete opposite of what we actually go on to do. But whatever we'll do well.
And I think, it's difficult to say we want to do something unique, because we, obviously there's a certain expectation now of what English sparkling wine is. But I suppose the way we made our mark in the Languedoc with our Domaine Sainte-Rose property was actually experimenting and doing things a little bit differently. Doing a single varietal barrel-aged Roussanne and branding it as such. Doing method traditional sparkling Blanc de Noir from the south of France. We make a very unique red blend called Les Derniers Cépages, which is a blend of Mourvèdre and Petit Verdot, which I think is still unique in the marketplace. We've certainly never come across another one. So we've dared to do things a little bit differently in order to stand out. That may be more difficult to do in the English sparkling wine market, but it's certainly been an approach that we've used in the south of France.
Do you think it hints at a kind of collaboration with nature in a way? Because you have to wait to see what you're given in order to respond to it. And see
definitely, because we certainly didn't think that we would get a name for making a single varietal Roussanne when we first arrived at Sainte-Rose, or that we'd be doing sparkling. It is very much. It has to grow organically, much like the vines. So
it's the reality of winemaking.
Absolutely.
And I think it's having that youthful creativeness of just being curious and exploratory. And therefore that drives innovation and doing things differently, and just being open to trying new things, because at the end of the day, failure is all about the road to success, and if you don't fail, you don't achieve. And so what we will do here is practice techniques, use equipment that potentially hasn't been used before, just to experiment with small lots, see what works and use it, and see what doesn't work and don't use that. It's part of the joy of doing this for a second time over, is to reignite that passion and enthusiasm about getting the best out of the soil in a totally different climate like the UK.
I think there's a curiosity as well.
Definitely.
This is something we touched on earlier. There's a trend, certainly in Champagne, towards very dry, lower dosage wines. What's your take on all of this?
Well, there's a personal take, and then I guess there's a business take. We are because we've been making wine for the last 14 years. We are lovers of wine and the purity in wine, and letting the terroir speak for each individual wine. And so, the critics would say that dosage sort of masks the true identity of the wine, and we would be a believer in that. We've seen, we follow our sparkling wines down in France all the way through the fermentation cycle. We see it as a base wine. We see it go through its secondary fermentation. We see it after 9 months. We see it after 16 months, and you watch the evolution. And then, you fall in love with it when you see it for the first time, and then all of a sudden you add a load of sugar to it. What we would normally do is we would create a zero dosage version for ourselves selfishly to drink and a few of our friends, but ultimately we know that for the marketplace you need to make sure that wine is in balance and the acidity is in check, and sometimes that means having to add dosage to achieve that. So as a purist we would prefer zero dosage, whether that's possible particularly in this climate, and still make a wine that's commercial that people want to drink. Remains to be seen. Once again, that is one of those dimensions that we're incredibly open-minded to. I would hate to be prescriptive and say this is what we're going to do here in the UK, because I'm sure whatever I say will be completely wrong in terms of what we actually do in reality, until we see the quality of the fruit, until we see the finish, pH and acidity of the wine, so I couldn't make that judgment.
And do you think also seeing the reception from the consumer, from the public, when you release a wine that's
Certainly, I think, and because we have such good relationships with our existing customers for our Santrose wines, we won't be afraid of, having customer visits down here and actually doing tastings pre-disgorgement to look at how the wine is evolving and getting immediate feedback.
I think one of the things that as we've learnt about sparkling wine production is the fascination that many of the method traditional sparkling producers, Champagne particularly, but also England, will dose differently for different markets, because the Asian market historically likes sweeter wines than does, for example, us, the Anglo-Saxons, the Americans, and the Brits. So it may well be that for you could even go to a niche beyond a niche, which is you may find a wine community even within the UK that are willing to listen to the argument about zero dosage wines and will accept the fact that they may look a little bit more high in acidity. So I think there's the opportunity, irrespective of the marketplace, to still give the consumer the option. And as long as you have the ability, and this is all about channel control, i.e. having the ability to speak to the consumer, as long as you're able to tell the story and why it looks the way it does, I think there's a very interesting discussion you can have. But there are only certain forums, and a lot of times they're non-traditional forums, where you get the access to have that discussion with the end consumer and explain why you've done what you've done. So often, these are bottles of wine that are pulled off a shelf and someone likes it or they dislike it. Whereas if you can find a medium, an example might be Naked Wines, where someone who might spot high acidity might, at least you have the opportunity to explain why it looks that way, and hopefully if you're a wine lover you'll accept that and see it, the beauty of it, and see the positive attributes you achieve as a consequence of going for a zero dosage wine.
Some of the positive attributes link very well to gastronomy. Have you got any thoughts on gastronomic wine pairing with sparkling wines? Is that anything that's of interest?
Certainly, and I think it's growing. I think as a lot of people who have been I suppose turn to sparkling wine, whether it's through Prosecco because it's accessible. You hear more and more about people who actually that's their preference over still wine now, and therefore there is a lot more exploration of gastronomic food pairing. I mean, I think traditionally it was always that it must be something light, and it must be shellfish or sushi. I think now there is more development, and I suppose because of our preference for red. For Pinot dominant blends of Champagne style, I think there's a lot more that could be done as far as exploring the options for food pairing, and because the reds would just give that little bit more body, they're a little bit more fruit driven and complex, and so they can stand up to a lot of different flavours.
Yeah, I remember we took a couple of English very high acid wines. We took them into Chinatown and had them with pork belly and duck.
Beautiful.
It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
It's really good.
Yeah.
But then, will you be building up reserve wines? What's your view on that?
The answer to that question is yes. That is the strategy. Speaking honestly, there is an economic dimension to those decisions, and it's an issue that all fledgling industries suffer from, and the English wine industry is young, and therefore there is the tendency and the commercial drive to release wines that are of a vintage to get them out there quickly. Certainly, for the long term, we'll certainly develop a section of reserve wines. How much, once again, I'd hate to be prescriptive on. It really depends on what volume we get off those blocks this year, and we could have half a kilo per vine, we could have 2 kilos per vine, and if it's 2 kilos per vine, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of how much you keep back. If it's half a kilo vine, you're going to have a lot more pressure to release those wines early for return of cash.
Certainly it would be the aspiration, just because it is that insurance policy, as we talked about earlier, that it's, you know, on years where you could have a really challenging climate over the summer and a very difficult vintage, it is that way of being able just to, you know, to smooth things over and aim for consistency, which is something that we've learned to work with in the Languedoc. Not that we have reserve wines, but just by having a lot of different varieties, so you can blend out certain issues if there have been any in particular vintages. So certainly aspirationally it is something that we'd like to be able to do, because I think that consistency is a big challenge for English sparkling wines, and so reserve wines are definitely the way to go.
Very good. You mentioned something when we were in the vineyard, we were talking about pressing. Pressing methods. I'm not an expert on this, but it sounded very interesting.
Well, there's different types of presses, and the most commonly used press type, I should say commonly used, that I guess has the physical presence that people see when they go to Champagne, would be I guess it's an automated basket press called a coquard. They're very oxidative in their process, and there's no decrying that oxidation plays an important role in the production of more traditional sparkling wines. We've always been an advocate of being able to capture the full flavour spectrum, the full rainbow of flavours or colours that any given variety can produce, and that's certainly what we've done down in France. And so we've decided here for this project to buy a standard, what they call bag press or pneumatic press, but it has what they call an inert system. So it's basically uses nitrogen gas to protect from oxidation the juice and the must during the pressing cycle, which is incredibly oxidative. You can imagine the bag, you know, squeezes, fills, and retracts, and as it retracts, it draws in air and oxidates the must. And if you saw juice that comes out of an inert press, it would be green, particularly obviously if it comes from a white variety. If a standard bag press without nitrogen, it would be brown. And I'm not saying one's good and one's bad, what I'm saying is they're different. And so our aspiration is to be able to do a combination of the two, ferment things separately, keep things separately, and the brighter, fruitier side of the inert dimension will play a dimension in the resulting wines. Places like Champagne, they're not allowed to use this technology, so they oxidate everything. And as I said, you know, that style works, but there's an opportunity to, you know, experiment in this new area, this new country in terms of wine production, and play around with some of these things. The addition to that is that the press manufacturers are looking at different gases, so not just nitrogen, and therefore even looking at the use of oxygen in the system, but it's actually controlled, and because it's controlled, it's replicable. You can actually repeat it, you can monitor it, so in any given year you can look back at your level of oxidation and repeat it again. At the moment it's literally, you know, who knows, they just don't know how it happens. So, you know, we'd be big advocates that there is, you know, wine is very much about art, but there's a science dimension to it, and we should, you know, honour, accept, and try and include new technologies in the way in which we, you know, create wines.
Okay. One quick one. When can we expect our first?
Well, first bottles from Simpsons Wine Estate. Hopefully, end of 2018, 2019. Realistically, where we probably are looking at, most people are doing 2 to 3 years aging on lees, and I think we'd be no exception to that rule. Again, you know, as with so many of your questions, you know, we will need to see what the quality of the fruit is coming off the vineyard this year, but we would be aspiring to age for 2 years. So it's really keep your eyes peeled from 2018.
I think you only get one opportunity to make a first impression, and we know that. So whatever we release will be
has to be right.
It has to be right.
Yeah.